Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, DC. Today, we will talk about the UK, its economy, its trade policies, its future. And I have two great guests with me today to help us understand the situation. Simon Fraser is a former permanent Undersecretary of the Foreign Office and Commonwealth Office in the UK, and now a co-founder and managing partner at Flint Global. Gregory Messenger is an associate professor of law at the University of Bristol Law School. You're both very welcome. So nearly exactly 6 years ago, the 29th of March in 2017, the UK formally asked to leave the European Union. This was, as you know, a consequence of the referendum in June, the year before. There were difficult talks and negotiations that followed, and the UK formally left the UK on the 1st of February 3 years ago in 2020. There was a special protocol dealing with this specific situation of the Northern Ireland that didn't really work. Prime Minister Boris Johnson had issues with it. So that has been lots of negotiations around this for quite some time. And a preliminary agreement, the so-called Windsor Framework, was agreed only 10 days ago and looks to be adopted by all partners. So what has happened since the UK left? The UK wanted to be free from the burdens of EU regulation, make their own trade agreement, and be a political and economic independent global player. And then came the pandemic with harsh lockdowns in the UK and several other countries, Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, inflation, and high energy prices, etc. But most economies in the OECD have bounced back after the pandemic, but not the UK. The inflation is still high, and growth seems to be the smallest among all G7 countries, and trade has fallen more in comparable countries. So how much of this is due to Brexit? This is a debatable question, of course. We'll look into this. The think tank Centre for European Reform claims in a recent study that the UK's economy is 5.5% smaller than it would have been had the UK remained in the EU. Investments are 11% lower and trading goods 7% lower. Some of these figures are more or less confirmed by Adam Posen in an article for CPR, but then there are other newer studies to point to much smaller impact. A recent Ipsos poll also shows that 54% of the Brits think that Brexit has been a bad thing for the economy. Only 21% think it's been a good thing. But some of these economic difficulties that the UK is facing were there long before the pandemic, long before Brexit as well. And today, as we speak, actually, the Minister of Economy is presenting a new budget, which, of course, would be important for the future. So mixed statistics, of course, mixed feelings. But how, starting with you, Simon, how is the UK economy doing today?
Well, thank you very much. I think you've summarized it well. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that the UK economy is powering ahead. Growth is quite low, as you've said. It's the lowest in the G7. And actually, the Bank of England projections for growth are lower in the UK than, for example, the Fed in the US and the ECB in the Eurozone. We also have quite a lot of industrial disruption. We have a number of strikes, so there is sort of unrest in the economy reflecting the cost of living problems that we're having in the UK, not unique to the UK, but quite acute here. And of course, we've been through a period of very considerable political instability, which has economic consequences. So I think the situation is not particularly rosy. That I don't want to be too gloomy about it, however. I think it's important to say that the entire debate on UK trade and the economy remains highly emotive in the context of Brexit and immersed in the politics of Brexit. So you do tend to get on the one side a sort of denial about the economic impact, and on the other side a sort of exaggerated catastrophism about it. And we've got to steer a course through the middle. And it's also worth noting that no major party is currently arguing that we should rejoin the EU, or indeed the single market, or indeed the customs union. And I don't believe we're going to in the foreseeable future. So nobody really has there's a shared political interest in not dwelling on the downsides of Brexit. but actually looking forward. And in that context, if you'll permit me, there's four things I'd like very briefly to say to frame the debate. The first is that in my view, it is incontestable that Brexit has played a considerable role in weakening the EU's economy and our trade position, at least in the short term. And you mentioned the consensus of economists about the reduction in GDP as a consequence of Brexit. I think that is undeniable. And I don't think it's surprising, frankly, because once we chose Brexit, because of the politics of sovereignty, I always thought we would end up with a hard Brexit based on a free trade agreement with the EU. And that means we have materially impeded our economic relationship with our major market in goods, but especially in services, both in terms of market access and additional administrative costs. So there's bound to be a consequence. And on top of that, you've mentioned the evidence about the foregone investment. And I think our inward investment levels are only now still at roughly the same levels as in 2016. So, I think Brexit is not the sole reason for these developments, but I think it is an important one. And that is very much my view. Of course, COVID, Ukraine, and other factors come into play. Second point then, and I think Greg may be better placed to answer this question than me, but can that situation be reversed? The damage that has been done, and given the relative trade volumes, I don't think that the potential increase in trade with other markets is going to offset what we've lost with the European Union. I think that was always a bit of a fantasy. In fact, you see the very interesting numbers. I think Greg will validate this, that UK goods export volumes to the rest of the world, not only the EU, but to the rest of the world, are falling behind our competitors. So if that's true, that's interesting. And the trade advantages that we're going to get from free trade agreements with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, even India, and the CPTPP, I don't think are going to materially offset the loss from the European Union. So we can look at that further, but I think those who said, look, we will trade immensely more with the rest of the world were being slightly over-optimistic about that. Third point, and I think this is really important, I think the debate, however, is often being framed in the wrong way here, because rather than sort of conventional trade policy, the most important thing is whether the UK can boost its international economic performance through greater productivity, investment, and competitiveness after Brexit. So through the wider economic policies and taking advantage of the so-called Brexit freedoms that we have. And that's going to require a pretty sophisticated combination of regulatory flexibility, investment, fiscal policy, focus on science and technology, skills policy, and indeed immigration policy, which is very controversial. And the government is trying to address this, but so far I think the evidence is that they haven't really made a great deal of progress. Advocates of Brexit would say, and quite fairly, it's early days, but there's a lot of work to do. And very briefly, my fourth introductory point is this, that we've got another really big challenge, which is linked to Brexit, which is how the UK is going to operate now in a world of competing and antagonistic economic blocs. The US, China, and the EU, principal amongst them, where geopolitical tensions are increasingly now being expressed through mechanisms of economic policy, whether it's restricting access to technology, reconfiguring supply chains, etc. And I think there's some really hard choices ahead for us, to what extent we're going to align with the United States on China policy, where the UK is going to sit between the US and the EU in the world of net zero subsidies, and how are we going to compete in state aid from the single national resource base in that context. I think those are really big challenges, and they do, at least in part, flow directly from the Brexit decision. So I'll stop there, but I hope that was a useful set of introductory thoughts.
Thank you very much, Simon. Indeed, extremely useful. And we'll come back to several of your points, but I wanted to give the word to Craig. Greg, as well. Do you agree with this? What's your assessment? How is the UK doing today?
Yes,
if you want to complete on the trade issues as well.
Yes, thank you, Cecilia. I mean, I think Simon's right on these key points. I think it's quite interesting if we kind of think about how we got here in terms of our trade policy, right? There are a few phases. So the first phase essentially was crisis management. After the Brexit referendum, this realization of oh, right, WTO has to get sorted out. We were always members, but we have to sort out the legalities of our schedules, separating it out from the EU and so on. We have to be an independent voice. We have to sort out the divorce and then our arrangement with the EU, which is fundamentally an FTA with additional elements. And then we also have to get all of those FTAs that we had through the EU, we have to, quote unquote, roll them over. Part of our continuity program, about 40 free trade agreements that had to be renegotiated as UK agreements. So all of that was kind of, how do we sort of shift over from not being a member state into what we quote unquote, similar to what we had beforehand. One of the challenges, and I think one of the issues that it's left us with, which speaks to a number of the points that Simon's made, is a bit of an FTA fixation. A bit of sort of fetishization of FTAs as the policy rather than tools for a policy. And I think that's one of the big challenges we've had. We kind of then went into this penny dropping moment, I think, which was political class, hell for leather, US agreement. We want a US agreement straight away, and Australia and New Zealand and GCC and India and CPTPP after that. And I think slowly realizing, one, that's actually, unless you've got an objective in place, it's not really all that helpful. The economists and team in the trade ministry being very open, really good actually, very clear and transparent about publishing the information and being quite open about saying that the growth is not going to be what, as Simon said, it's certainly not going to offset leaving the EU and particularly actually customs union. That was the really, really big issue because it's rules of origin that's affected our traders largely in one area. So you kind of have that. And I think the other thing, which was we were thinking very much of trade policy as external trade policy, right? Bilateral agreements, multilateral trade policy. And of course, the problem is, as soon as you're then doing your new agreements, what do we want to do? And this speaks to Simon's issue about the wider economic picture. What's our policy on agricultural subsidies and industrial subsidies and climate adjustment and net zero transition and security and foreign investment screening and all of these things, development policy, unilateral preferences, all of these things, which you have to know, you can't put stuff in an FTA if you don't know what your own policy is at home. And so that was happening, but quite slowly. And there was a fast pace on the external stuff. So I think where we're now, and I'll be perhaps naively quite positive in the sense that I think the realization is a healthy one, and I think a largely accurate one, which is free trade agreements are not ends in and of themselves, they're means. And I think we see that with the US agreement, right? Obviously, those you're based in DC, those on the call will know better than me. There is no appetite in the US for FTA policy generally, right? But imagine it were, from a parochial UK perspective, it is really healthy to have a political class that now says an agreement at any cost is not correct. That isn't what we want. That seems self-evident and should just be natural, but that wasn't where we were beforehand. It was, and again, a large part of the narrative around we leave the EU to get closer to our quote-unquote historic partners like the US and India and so on. That was part of that deal, right? So I think being a bit more realistic about that and looking at what we can do with our free trade agreement. So the New Zealand agreement, really interesting provisions on climate, on fossil fuel subsidies. The Australia agreement, really interesting stuff on trade and gender. A specific chapter, but also in the financial services annexes as well. So there's lots of stuff that's really interesting there, but requiring us to think a bit more carefully and a bit more nuanced. And I think the other element is realizing, and for the UK, I think this is very important, and it has been for a long time, that trade, one, is not your entire economic policy, but also trade is not just economic policy, it's also geostrategic. And that's not a great insight, right? US concluded an FTA with Oman, one of its first bilaterals. That wasn't because of the large market access opportunities, right? I mean, that's the sort of space that lots of countries are in, and that's fine. And for us, I think that's a big part of CPTPP, which I think we'll come to. So I think for the UK, the interesting thing is, and as Simon says, kind of where do we stand? Because effectively, in trade terms, we are a middle power. We are not guaranteed a seat at the table. So why are our partners going to listen to us? Why are we going to be in the room taking decisions and being involved? We, one, need to know how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the EU and the US. I think more generally, I think we'll kind of fall into our traditional position, which is we are just in between the two in different areas because, and at least in trade policy, whereas 20 years ago, it was very transatlantic EU versus US, we're just worried about China now. That is the big sort of in the words of a new government review, the systemic challenge, the epoch-defining systemic challenge. So it's how we'll do that. I think for the UK, it's also a large part is our key priority is just, what is it that we offer? Where's our value, right? What gets us into the room, into discussing these things with these partners, and how are we going to deal with them when they do stuff that we don't like? We're not big enough to subsidize on the scale that the EU and the US does on climate. How are we going to respond to that? Because they're not going to remove their policies just because we don't like them. So how do we position ourselves? What do we add in terms of value? And I think there is lots of interesting work being done on that. But I think that's kind of our priority. It's like how we come to terms with our position, not as a member state in the EU, but actually as an independent actor.
Wow, that's a lot of things to dig into, apparently. But leaving sort of the Brexit behind, just want your quick opinion on, with the new Windsor Framework that looks to be accepted. With that done, if nothing pops up the coming days, is then Brexit done? Can we move on with the new conditions? Or do you expect anything coming up? The DUP hasn't really confirmed yet that they will agree. Simon?
Who are you putting that? In my view,
anyone?
I think that Rishi Sunak has done a very good job on the Windsor Framework, and I welcome it. And of course, he has challenges with the DUP, and of course, he has challenges in his own party to deliver it. But I think the signs are that people are recognising, a sufficient critical mass of people are recognising that this is in the interests of Northern Ireland and the UK, and indeed the EU. And I welcome it. Now, to go from that to say, does that mean Brexit is done? I think is quite a leap, because actually picking up on Greg's point, I think what you're hearing from us is really we are still in the very early stages of understanding what Brexit means for this country and how this country is going to adapt to it. But what the Windsor Framework has done, followed rapidly by Rishi Sunak's visit to Paris, has sent a signal that the government in the UK now is moving on from a very antagonistic posture towards the European Union to a more, you might say, more pragmatic, moderate policy of engagement. And that was reflected indeed in the review of the Integrated Review on Foreign Policy, which Greg mentioned, where in the previous version, under Boris Johnson, the EU had hardly been mentioned, and now Europe is mentioned more as an important part of British foreign policy. And if you combine that with the recent AUKUS meeting, all that put together, I think what you see for the first time in many years is a sort of more coherent and balanced expression of British international policy and positioning, in which a positive relationship with Europe is an important part. And of course, given what we've seen in Ukraine, that is obviously correct. And given the strategic challenge of China, doubly so.
Yeah, so if I may see that, I mean, just to jump in, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and I think one of the sort of the big question, so what do we mean by is Brexit done? In terms of kind of the formal elements, yes, okay, fine. In terms of, does this mean we have, that's it, the relationship? I just don't think that there is an end to that, and the Swiss example is a good case study for that, right? And to be honest, even when we were inside, it was never done either, right? Periodically, you have treaty reform, you have changes, you have discussions of what happens. And so I think there's always going to be something. I think what's really, really, I'm hopeful and really healthy would be simply for the issues that we necessarily will have to be dealt with at an official level, technical, not terribly exciting. Let's have questions over the best formulation for the SPS certificates that we may or may not need and the e-cert systems, whatever that stuff might be. And we just do it away from the front page of the tabloids. We do not need that sort of engagement. I don't think it's constructive. And I think what we previously had was a way of engaging with the EU, which was very much targeted towards a domestic audience, which simply was not constructive in relation to developing a functioning relationship. We're going to have challenges in relation to Northern Ireland and the trade arrangements. It's the nature of things. That's not unusual. There's lots of exceptional circumstances and positions. You know, the EU coordination with Turkey over free trade agreements. In theory, there's meant to be very effective coordination over tariff policy. There isn't. Like, that's fine. Like, these things happen. You fudge it. You do what you can. But you need goodwill and trust to make those things work. And that's not where we've been. I think we're now building it up again, which is really, really positive. So I think in terms of Brexit being done, I would just see it as having a healthy, constructive, not always on the same page, that's fine, but a relationship where you can actually speak to each other effectively. And that I do feel like has moved quite a lot forwards, and even in a surprisingly short amount of time.
That's also the signals that we hear from Brussels, that there's been an enormous fatigue on all these, formalistic discussions that are very political as well. But now, provided that this framework, Windsor Framework, enters into force, at least that can be put aside. There has been new initiatives. We saw Prime Minister Sunak visiting France the other day. There seems to be a very close sort of renewal of the friendship there as well. And as you both mentioned on Ukraine, there has been fantastic cooperation, and the UK is really leading there and is coordinating very tightly with allies, the EU, of course, but also with other allies. And hopefully that is something that you can build your foreign policy cooperation on in the future. Then there will always be issues. But looking forward, I think it's very interesting because, of course, the whole world faces itself in a very awkward situation now. We have the US moving more inwards when it comes to trade policy, not doing any trade agreements at all, at least if they involve market access or tariffs. They're more security oriented. There is a kind of trade war going on with China. Europe is sort of squeezed there, even if, of course, there's a lot of cooperation with the US on China, but EU is not in a position to sort totally decouple from China either. And then UK finds itself a little bit there. I mean, a long ally of the US, but also with its European position. And with a weak WTO as well, and all the other partners there. So how do you see the UK formulating its trade and economic policy there? There's obviously the CPTPP, and for those of you who have not heard this acronym, it means the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership with 12 countries. The UK is about to join, at least negotiations are going well. There are also other applicants there, China, Taiwan, obviously, and then a whole range from Central America. We have Ecuador, Uruguay, Costa Rica. I personally think the EU should join as well, but that's another discussion we should have. But this is, of course, a much more dynamic part of the world than Europe and US right now when it comes to trade and others. So is this where the UK has its kind of trade future, setting rules and standards with allies in the Pacific? How do you see this? You want to start, Craig or Simon?
I think Greg should start on this. It's probably he's the expert. I've got some thoughts, but
well, so no pressure, Simon. So what I would say, I mean, I think there's a couple of different elements here. I think from a weirdly UK perspective, not that it is to do with economic compensation for withdrawal from the EU, etc. I do think there is an opportunity for UK businesses so traditionally, for those on the call that might not be aware, so under a free trade agreement, you don't automatically get preferences, better market access, the reduced tariffs. You have to show that you qualify, right? Because basically it's a club. Like, we've agreed to things, we both compromised, and other people shouldn't be able to just jump in and get the beneficial treatment. So rules of origin. UK businesses, many of which have never had to deal with rules of origin because they were within the EU, which most importantly was a customs union. So there's no rules of origin. So everything is shuttled around all the time. They've had to learn about this, come to terms with it, realize what it is, adjust supply chains in many instances and business models. It does also mean that once you start looking at that, the difference between saying, well, how do I qualify for the rules of origin under the TCA as opposed to, say, the Japan agreement or the Korea agreement or the Mexico agreement, is it that different potentially? So I think one of the advantages of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is the rules of origin are actually very relaxed by point of comparison to other trade agreements. So hopefully the idea is that it'll improve the sort of diversity of options and supply, which in terms of now very fashionable to be concerned around the resilience of supply chains, right? Particularly post-COVID, but also sanctions policy in relation to Russia, Ukraine. So I think there's elements of that about this idea. For the UK, the Indo-Pacific tilt is a key plank of foreign policy generally, this idea that this is going to be kind of this economic center for gravity for the foreseeable. So we need to be very engaged with that. I think the regulatory element is really interesting because CPTPP, even though the US isn't a member, CPTPP is based off US drafts. So it was essentially off TPP, which was largely a US drafted FTA with others involved. But so it comes from that tradition of agreements. The UK has inherited through our continuity program, EU model approach to trade agreements. And our new ones are these interesting hybrids. We've got bits which are sort of CPTPP looking and bits which are EU looking. In some areas of regulation, this could be quite useful. We can coordinate quite effectively and try and encourage the use of certain types of standards. That's fine. But there's certain areas where there's just disagreement between those two different approaches, and you can't escape it. The US does not like the use of UNECE standards for autos. The EU doesn't like the US's approach to agri-food regulation and the references to science. You just can't get away from those differences. And this is kind of in between. So for the UK, we're kind of trying to thread through this middle ground, which is going to be quite interesting to see how we manage it. But I think the sort of that's part of that focus. We already have agreements with a number of CPTPP partners sort of anyway. So I think this is about sort of crowding out and trying to get into those sort of structures, which I think offer quite a lot, but is often underestimated. They're hooks for dialogues with partners.
Hello? Sorry, I lost the connection for a second, but yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think that's very interesting. Just thinking about your question, Cecilia, I mean, I have to go back really to the is Brexit over point to start, I think. And I mean, Brexit isn't over in the sense that there'll always be people like me who will be arguing that the UK's best position would be as a member of the EU, and that's not going to go away. But also, actually, a number of the trade measures related to Brexit, like I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but rules of origin and things, I mean, they still haven't really kicked in yet. So for businesses operating in the UK, they still haven't confronted the full reality of the Brexit situation. But I think it's, having done Brexit, and I'm not in any way suggesting you haven't, it's obviously sensible to focus on other markets and on growth markets, and the so-called Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific tilt in trade policy reflecting security policy is a sensible one, and Greg's outlined some of the mechanisms for that. But I think, for me, the big story behind all this is, we are living in a world that is changing very, very fast in very significant ways. We have a very important election coming up in the United States next year, which could change, I think myself, whatever people might criticize President Biden for, I think he's been a good president. And certainly from the perspective of Western unity and sort of coherence amongst like-minded countries dealing with the challenges of the world, he has been good. And that may not necessarily continue. Then you have, of course, the evolution of China. You have what is going to flow from Ukraine and the future of Russia, which is something we really are not discussing sufficiently. And what all that means for the knock-on in terms of post-Ukraine, the future for the European Union and the structures of Europe. These are really big questions that affect the UK and others. And in that context, I mean, I work in an environment now where we advise businesses, and frankly, they're not so concerned about the nuances of free trade agreements or the CPTPP or others. What they want to know is, how is access to technologies, the transfer of technologies going to be constrained by geopolitical concerns? What are the rules on dual-use goods going to be? I mean, the tightening up of dual-use goods controls towards China, for example, is quite remarkable. How is the environment and context for research in our universities going to be affected, first of all by Brexit, but by constraints on engagement with China? What are the new security considerations going to be in relation to inward investment and M&A activity in our markets? These are the really critical economic, trade-related, investment-related issues which, reflect the geopolitically driven world that we're now living in. And, of course, we need trade policy. Of course, we should be supporting multilateral organizations like the WTO, which impose order and collective rules in these areas of activity. But there are some huge testing new questions out there that we're all facing.
Yes, absolutely. And the whole world is struggling with that. And ideally, of course, some of these issues would be discussed in a multilateral framework, such as WTO The UK, being a member of the EU, has always been a very strong supporter of the multilateral system, of international norms, and so on. But we know, unfortunately, that WTO, even if most trade is actually conducted under WTO rules, still that is really not up to modern challenges, both in its way of functioning and having rules on digital trade and green trade and so on. But this is also something that the current UK government has expressed very clear its will to work with others and allies to try to reform the WTO in a situation where that is difficult and where we have not seen the investment from the US as we would have liked to have. And of course, without the US really engaging with EU, UK, other allies and China, it is really hard to see any progress. It's, on the other hand, there is no real alternative to the WTO. So how do you see the UK playing there? Are there any new initiatives, or is there anything, the background and the traditional relations that the UK has with countries such as India, also a difficult partner in the WTO, can use in order to try to push reform here?
If I may, can I jump in on that? Sort of desperate to get in on the WTO angle. So I think it's one of the things I'm really that's been very interesting is, again, our position. If you're not one of the superpowers, you need a rule-based system because you're absolutely dependent on it to protect you and enforce your rights, right? So there's kind of that. So and the UK, it's been part of our brand for a long time, which is we support the rules-based international order. We've traditionally had a very good presence in terms of international structures and so on, and international lawyers as well, actually, particularly. So that's always been kind of part of what we do. One of the wonderful things that when we had a much more, speaking frankly, as a dysfunctional political situation at home, was extremely hard work of very impressive UK officials working, for example, in Geneva and doing the slightly not very glamorous but hard work of chairing committees and accessions and so on, and really building up our reputation. Because when New Kids on the Block, we might have been around and founding members of the GATT, but it doesn't matter. You've got to sort of show your stripes now, and no one will listen to us because we're not big enough unless we show that we're competent, right? So I think the UK has been really actively involved, and I think we've been very active in a few different areas, which is really useful. In relation to, there was a plurilateral agreement on domestic regulation of trade and services, which it's not going to change the world, but it's certainly a good thing. The fisheries subsidies agreement, which was agreed last summer. So the first time that we have binding rules prohibiting and restricting illegal subsidies that contribute to illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing. This is a thing that everyone thought we should have done 20 years ago. Everyone committed to have had it done 3 years ago. So it did take a long time. It's not a perfect agreement. It has gaps, it has problems and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, in terms of absolutely foundational change, this is the first time we have an agreement at the WTO that is concerned with environmental harm, not economic harm. It's not concerned about economic injury to fishing businesses. It's concerned with damage to stocks. So that's absolutely, in the UK, really actively working with others. And I think that's one of the things where it's been a bit of a tension because there's an expectation at home, frankly, a slightly parochial one, that we lead, quote unquote. And I think very sensible people understanding that that's just not how the institution functions. In terms of the North-South elements, I think you need to be realistic about what's going to happen, right? India's not suddenly going to agree to everything. It never does at the WTO. That's just not its brand. But in terms of the UK as a quote unquote bridge, right? The sort of the North-South bridge, again, a thing that we like to say a lot at home. It can always be better. There's problems to do with the amount of money that gets put into development and aid and so on, but has actually been very active in engaging with developing country partners across the piece. And I think in areas as well where we actually have value add. So the big one is standard setting. We contribute a lot to discussions around that. The International Organization for Standardization introduced net zero guidelines. So not standard, but guidelines on net zero. Those were really driven from the British Standards Institute. Like, that's BSI really doing a lot of hard work in the background to push that forward. So there's a lot of that stuff that can help in lots of different areas of the so-called structured discussions at the WTO. So where I think the UK is identifying climate, services, digital, there's certain areas like that, and dispute settlement reform is areas where we kind of want to invest. There's other things which we'll do elsewhere. So digital is the classic one, right? So we're pushing a lot on digital agreements with Singapore, Ukraine, and elsewhere, but that's just being done on a bilateral basis in the hope that you create a bit of a network and then others do the same thing and then you all coalesce and then it's easier for you all to agree on something. But in the WTO, I think I'm actually really sort of pleased to have seen how the UK has engaged quite positively in that space.
Yeah, I mean, the UK will continue to be a champion of international rules and multilateralism. But let's face it, I mean, after Brexit, I think our reputation in some aspects of international cooperation and respect for international rules has been challenged in itself, and we have to face up to that. And I think the other big challenge for us is going to be resource. I mean, the UK is operating on a whole range of fronts as an independent country and a nation with a fairly limited sort of bureaucratic capacity. And you can't expect. I mean, it's a great part. We're a medium-sized player in these debates, and we can't expect to be leading in all of them. So I think we need to focus on certain priorities, and we need to identify areas where we think we have a brand advantage, which we can really bring to play in international negotiation, and do that. And in that context, I think something we haven't probably talked enough about in this discussion yet is climate change and the sort of COP system, which of course links to trade and green finance in an incredibly important way. And there, the UK has an important role to play, and I think COP26 did play quite a good sort of coordinating role. I was very disturbed when it seemed that the Prime Minister might not go to Sharm el-Sheikh, and in the end he did go. And I think COP28 this year is going to be a really important multilateral proof point for international cooperation. So we should be focusing on that. And of course, that takes us to the whole question of the massive investment, international mixture of public and private investment that is going to be needed in order to achieve those goals of net zero, which is probably, the greatest politico-economic challenge of our times. I don't profess to understand it fully, but I think it's extraordinarily important.
Yes, coming back to that, and this is an area where I think some of the free traded-minded countries in the European Union misses the UK around the table to discuss this, because of course this is the big issue now. How are we going to make sure that we can invest in green transition, in green technology, in fossil-free energy, but doing that in a way that is responsible and does not put us in a sort of subsidy race with each other in Europe, but also between Europe and US, and I include UK in this, and making sure that we can have a positive spiral instead of a subsidy race that is on the horizon that it could happen. And of course, you mentioned, Simon, that UK is a smaller player here, absolutely, but you have tradition and instincts here. That a voice that could really be the voice of reason here. How is the discussion going on? If you look at what's happening in the EU with the discussion there on using the green investments, and also alleviating or loosening the state aid rules again, and the IRA, because of course UK companies could also take advantage of the IRA provisions. So how is the discussion going there? And do you see possibilities of a more European cooperation here?
Well, I think to be honest with you, there's a lot of concern in the UK. Indeed, I was talking only yesterday to a very senior person in the Confederation of British Industry who was expressing deep concern about how the UK would be able to react to the measures that are being announced this week in the EU in response to the IRA, and the fact that British business was going to potentially be squeezed there. And of course, the other aspect of that concern is, you're right, British businesses can take advantage of the IRA, for example, but there are all sorts of additional requirements added to the IRA in terms of content requirements and so forth. And one of the things you're seeing in the UK at the moment is this interesting debate about delisting of companies from the London Stock Exchange going elsewhere. And that's a great concern in relation to the future of the city. So there are a number of concerns here. And I hope that, for example, after the Windsor Framework, if we can get back into collaboration on Horizon with the European Union, if we can start talking about collaboration in terms of investment and state aids issues in a less sort of confrontational way, that must be in the interest of the United Kingdom. But at the moment, there is a vulnerability for us here, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to jump. I mean, I think Simon's absolutely right. I think for the UK, it's a big issue around the shift, what potential shift in what will happen around supply chains, right? I think UK businesses are going to be concerned about saying, well, right, and then we're going to have to have things move away, and in various different ways to meet local content requirements under the IRA. That's a real problem for us. We do not have the resource, and or better said, there is no political capital to invest to the levels that the EU is doing or the US is doing, in order to try and compensate somehow in other ways to say, but we'll have our own version of a green subsidy program. There just isn't, which makes it ironic that we had those debates during the withdrawal and TCA negotiations about us wanting to be able to subsidize as much as we like. I mean, the UK's never done that, so it's a bizarre sort of thing to have disputed. But I think there's a real concern around how we do, not just the US, also the EU's large number of multiple subsidy packages built around the Green Deal. One of the big worries, I think, from the UK perspective is just strategy. How on earth do you basically get the US to adjust according to us? Because there's elements which are very clearly not compliant with WTO obligations. They're not going to get rid of that because we ask, right? So basically, and the nature of trade relations is to say, fine, let's go with a shopping list. What is the stuff that would mitigate this for us? But again, trying to get that over is not a straightforward thing. And I think if we learn lessons from when the US had its steel and aluminium tariffs and negotiated an arrangement with the UK, we weren't top of the list. And frankly, the reason that we got something was because, again, people just meetings constantly hammering it out and raising it with officials all the time and saying, we need to talk about this and this needs to be settled. So for the UK, it's kind of, again, learning our place of how we manage these sorts of things, even as a solid, strong ally. So we'll have to see, and I think, Cecilia, as you say, I mean, one of the things is, yes, it's climate policy, but a lot of this is also just anti-China policy, which may or may not be sensible, like bracket that, but that's actually what a lot of this is about. It's not about climate, it's about China. And so again, where do you sit? You don't want to be standing next to China complaining about the US strategically. So how do we position ourselves is going to be a real challenge for the UK.
But it's also about America first, of course.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said it's also America first, of course.
Absolutely. And this China aspect is also something, I mean, it's a headache for all European capitals right now, because on the one hand, yes, there is a security threat. Yes, there is all this dimension of dual use that we are aware of. And there is this feeling that you do not want to replace energy dependence from Russia with raw material dependence from China, which is being discussed right now. But on the other hand, you know, China is there. It's an important trading partner. It's an important partner if you want to deal with the green transition as well. So here, of course, I mean, the EU is squeezed here, but the UK even more in a way. And it is linked to the whole IRA discussion in a way. So are these items that are being discussed in the security cooperation with the US, in AUKUS and so on, or is this something that will be addressed in a more bilateral way with the US, or can the EU and UK possibly find a common way here?
I mean, it's a very interesting point. I know the UK government has made its own approaches to the United States in relation to the IRA and the consequences of it, and will do that bilaterally, and is not in a position at the moment to do so in collaboration with the EU, because that relationship is not currently in that position. So that's where we are. One of the things that emerges from this, which I think is incredibly important for us in thinking about these sort of international economic and trade issues, is this challenge that all governments are having, which you've just alluded to, Cecilia, about how they balance within their policy making the security considerations with the economic considerations. And this is particularly relevant to relations with China. So within all governments, not only between governments, but within governments, you have this great debate going on between the security departments, the intelligence agencies, etc., and the economic and finance departments, with conflicting objectives. And at the moment, certainly in the British system, one of the issues is there isn't a satisfactory mechanism for, if you like, deciding those trade-offs within government. The default at the moment has veered towards security. So you see the tightening up of all these arrangements going on. And whereas previously in this country, under the Cameron-Osborne regime, for example, the default was towards economic openness. So within the UK, that's happening. I imagine certainly within the EU, in a different way, it's happening. For example, the differentiation between the German position and the position of some other member states. And of course, in the US, you have a harder line position, which is bipartisan as well. So it's a complicated sort of scenario to navigate that.
It's interesting, Japan as well. Japan's, for the UK, is very interesting sort of parallel, because Japan traditionally always very open, on a range of different things. I mean, not agriculture traditionally, but other stuff. And now really changing economic security as the focus. There is a certain element of, I can't help but feel that a lot of our concerns, over-reliance, over-dependence, being subject to the whims of a partner that we may be concerned about what their objectives are, suddenly using this as leverage against us. I mean, these are complaints that the Global South has had of what we do and other countries in the Global North for 100 years. It's very difficult not to feel that, like, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. I mean, this is the nature of, this is a consequence of a trade system that we want, which is that we are interlinked and dependent on each other, and therefore less likely to conflict. What I think at the moment we're seeing is a bit of a panic around how integrated we are. So, I mean, Russia-Ukraine in relation to sanctions was very interesting. I mean, obviously the whole thing is horrifying, but in terms of the sort of consequences for trade policy, the sanctions policy is very old-fashioned. Right, it's a real rejection of all the developments of the last 40 years of more targeting, more precision. It's like, no, it's back to full-on, large-scale bans. But I think the big thing with Russia-Ukraine is just, it's the test case for how will things go if there's a conflict with Taiwan. That's basically the background, right? Much as COVID was the test case for a climate crisis, and we didn't do great, Russia-Ukraine is the test case for Taiwan, where a conflict would be considerably more difficult, because Russia's an exporter of a couple of key products. China is a much more integrated partner, and that's a much bigger issue for how we manage it. So yeah, that's a real, like, and that's not just a UK issue, that's a US, EU, and everyone else issue.
Indeed, that's a huge question. I don't think we'll go there now in this episode, but we will certainly have reason to come back to that. There are a few questions coming in, and I think they all more or less relate to what we started to talk about in the beginning of the EU-UK. One is, and I read it out for you, I understand that the speakers consider it a very unlikely occurrence, but what would be a scenario, politically, economically, or otherwise spurred, that could bring the EU membership back on the table? And then there's another one. Could you see areas where adjusting to, say, CPTPP with severe ties to the EU, for instance, GDPR equivalents?
Shall I take the first of those? I think it's very interesting. And it allows me to say something which I wanted to say, which is about the election coming up, because I think it's important, if we're talking about the UK, that we recognise that there will be an election probably next year. And at the moment, the expectation is that the Labour Party, the opposition party, is likely to win that, although that is not a foregone conclusion by any means. And the point there to make is, in relation to the EU, is that although Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, opposed Brexit, the official policy of Labour, as I said at the top, is not to support re-entry into the EU, or indeed the single market or the customs union. And so that is a bipartisan position. Now, if Labour won massively, then it may be that would be on the table again. But I think that has to be what we work with. Now, to your questioner, Gideon Rachman wrote a piece in the FT about 2 weeks ago in which he said, look, this is the way in which the UK could get back into the EU. And it basically starts with us having to endure several years of severe economic underperformance, so that the notion that actually we're better off in the EU is consolidated, probably combined with a Labour win in the election and serious problems in the Conservative Party. And then he suggested that at some point there would be a referendum on whether or not we should consider re-entry, followed by a whole process of negotiation, and then another referendum on whether we re-enter. Now that is, pretty far-fetched, and much as it pains me to say so, I don't think that's the territory we are in, at least in the foreseeable future. So I think we really are in the territory of making the best of the situation that Brexit has led us to, and I think that's been the tone of this conversation. And there are serious challenges, there's no doubt, for us as a country, but the sooner that we engage in a very positive and constructive and well thought through way with what we want to do and what we can do in the world, the better, because there's been a large opportunity cost in what's happened in the last 6-7 years, where frankly we have lost a lot of time because, as Greg said at the beginning, we didn't know what we were getting into, and it's taken us a lot of time to work it out.
Thank you. Greg, do you want to answer the question on CPTPP and GDPR, which is the data protection agreement in the EU?
So it's a real challenge, because I mean, one of the sort of priorities for the EU in a lot of these agreements is sort of data protection and privacy and so on. There's a few other areas actually where CPTPP also presents a few challenges. There's one that's been well documented in relation to intellectual property. That it seems like it has been fixed. There are fixes for that can be done both nationally, but then also in relation to accession. So this is the other thing as well, is like when you join CPTPP, you conclude a number of different elements to it, and you can adjust commitments slightly within the partners. So, for example, a few of the members have agreed that they won't allow for investors to have rights to raise claims against the governments directly, so-called ISDS, investor status.
ISDS, yeah.
So you can adjust things slightly. I think in relation to GDPR, this is one of the more sort of intractable ones, because you end up having commitments which potentially don't allow you to meet your commitments elsewhere. Whether or not that can be resolved, again, it's a bit like, as I was saying, when Brexit's done, I think there are elements of this that have to be resolved bilaterally, separately with partners, and specifically with with the equivalence decisions with the EU, and just to negotiate some sort of safeguard mechanisms and so on. Those sorts of arrangements are not, it's not that they don't exist. We have them in different areas. There's comparators in relation to the EU law's relationship to the European Convention on Human Rights and so on, about sort of trusting unless certain things happen and so on. And I think there's ways to try and fix that, but I think that is definitely one of the bigger concerns. It's not only that, it's also, as I mentioned, agri-food regulation. There's potential challenges there as well. I think that one's a bit easier just because the EU is an outlier in relation to SPS compared to the rest of the world. That's slightly easier. But yeah, absolutely, there's potential concerns around that, and I think everyone's very live to them.
I think I saw Trade Minister Greg Hans saying the other day that joining the CPTPP would make it even harder to rejoin the EU one day. I don't know if you share that statement, but of course, as you say, if you join an organization that already exists, which has the basic rules set in place, you will have to, adopt a little bit, even if you can influence future setting, and you can have bilateral agreements, indeed, but you have to buy the whole package, more or less.
So, I mean, in terms of technically joining again the EU, I think technically, I think it'd be straightforward, because the EU model for accession is very, very easy. It's you swallow everything. Here is the acquis. It's yours. Take it. That's it.
Tick the box.
Yeah, exactly. And I strongly suspect there's very little appetite on the EU side to have a disruptive UK that's in two minds. But so that's sort of easier that way around, I think, than whether for businesses. And I think this goes to Simon's point, which is a really important one. We'll talk about these different agreements and we'll talk about various different things. Of course, from a commercial perspective, none of this is relevant, right? As in, that's not the language that's used. It's just, I want to do business in this country. Are they going to take these things from me? Am I going to get clearance? Am I going to be able to export successfully? Am I going to get signed off on this stuff?
Thank you. We are approaching the end, but can I ask you one last question, both of you? I mean, we have been trying, and I think that is the general mood, both in the EU and in the UK, at least in the more reasonable centre, to try to look forward. We can have opinions of what happened, whether it was good or not, but here we are. We have joint challenges, we have joint problems, we have a very difficult world with climate and still the health issues, and of course increased rivalry, China, US, subsidies, all that. What would be your I mean, of course, Simon, you've been in that position, you've been working at the Foreign Office, but what would be your advice for the British government on how to move forward on this now, to let go of the past, where do we go now economically, and to make sure that the UK can be, its full potential as a strong global player in Europe and in the world.
Well, I mean,
I didn't prepare you for this.
No, that's fine. I think the answer is you can't let go of the past because we're living with the consequence of it. And I do start with this, go back to the point that, we are in the early stages of adapting to Brexit. It's a huge shock to our international strategic position, which we have taken on. So I think my advice to ministers would be understand what has happened and think about it carefully and don't be in denial of it. Second, be realistic about what we can now achieve and don't get lost in sort of bombast and rhetoric because, you're trying to sell a political position and an ideology. Do not be ideological about it, be realistic about it. And thirdly, prioritize and focus on the relationships that really matter to us in the world. There's a lot of loose talk about, emerging power, growing economies, but actually there are some very key relationships with other democracies, with like-minded countries, the US, in Europe and elsewhere, as well as in Japan and elsewhere. And we really do need to work with them in the context of the world that you're describing. So those would be some of my key pieces of advice.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I was just going to think was in terms of kind of the UK-EU relationship, right, in trade, sort of over the longer period, what does it sort of look like? And I can't help but feel, in a really sort of in a positive way, sibling rivalry. I think that's the nice way to think about it, a competitive relationship between siblings. We actually share fundamentally the same objectives in the vast majority of areas in relation to trade. We have, because of the membership, we have shared regulatory frameworks and approaches for a long way. Even if we diverge, it's going to be tinkering around the edges for a while anyway. So we're coming in on various different ways on very similar pages. We're going to be each other's counterfactuals, which I think is interesting in terms of deciding how we make policy. So the UK's approach to development policy and trade, or climate and trade, we'll have a counterfactual from how the EU approaches things because we'll be able to see how we do things differently. I think that sort of competitiveness, I don't think is a bad thing in terms of who's doing it better, learning from each other and being competitive. But at the same time, at the end of the day, if you compare where are the poles in the global trading system, the US, China and the EU is basically where we're much, much closer in terms of positioning on nearly every single issue, to a lesser extent the US and certainly not China. So it just feels like we need to, as Simon says, remove the bombast, be a bit more realistic about where we share our positions and move forward. And it can actually be quite a constructive competitive relationship.
Sorry. Well, you've certainly not been bombastic, but you've helped us understand what's happening, what has happened, what should happen, and what could maybe happening. So thank you so much for your input to this, for helping us understand, for also being forward-looking as well. It's something that is in motion. I'm sorry about the sirens here in the background. It's in Washington. There's always someone important passing. But helping us understand what is at stake right now. I'm sure we will come back to this because it is moving target indeed. And I have also noted that in the newly created another acronym, European Political Community, with all the European countries of the continent, including Turkey and Norway, etc. The meeting next spring will actually be hosted in London, which I think is also in line with what you said. Forward-looking, trying to see, how can you work with allies in the most constructive way. So thank you so much, Simon Fraser. Thank you so much, Greg Messenger, for joining us, and to all of you who watched, thank you so much as well. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.